Thank you everyone for being here tonight. We so appreciate you being part of this wonderful program. I'm going to turn it over to Clarence White from the Eastside Freedom Library to say a few words.
Welcome everyone. We're glad you could be here this evening. It is our pleasure and privilege to not just have these esteemed writers with us tonight, but all the rest of you as well for this conversation. So I am the Associate Director of the Eastside Freedom Library, which means that I have the privilege of being in these virtual and physical rooms with artists and writers like we have tonight. The Eastside Freedom Library has a lot of events that occur a lot of the time. And one of the main themes of the editors of the book we're talking about tonight is more than a single story. And the Eastside Freedom Library is a place where we provide a space for a lot of the voices and a lot of the stories that tell a more true and honest narrative about this place that we live in. Both Carolyn Holbrook and David Mura have done a lot in the Twin Cities over the years to push that cause. I personally am very grateful to both of them for the work that they've done. Twin Cities has long been a very strong literary community. A lot of readers, a lot of writers, and quality stuff. But for a very long time, that landscape was dominated by white voices, and some very good writers, many of whom are our friends and colleagues. But because of the efforts over a long period of time from both David and Carolyn, that landscape of voices has not only become more diverse, but it has challenged the way that we think about this place, the Twin Cities, this place, the United States, this world that we live in ways that have not only given us a more true sense of where we live, but have helped us cultivate this community of very strong writers and very strong stories. So I'm glad that you're all here tonight. I'm glad that we have been able to be a part of this effort, this ongoing effort with the Ramsey County Historical Society, and partnering with other people like the Ramsey County Libraries and many other partners on literary and artistic events. Again, thank you everyone for being here. There are many more events that both the Eastside Freedom Library and the Ramsey County Historical Society partner with together, but on our own as well. Please take a look at our website. There's something going on all the time. So many things that it's hard to keep up with, but that is an embarrassment of riches, or as some people say, a happy problem. So again, throughout the evening, some of you may have questions. Put them in the chat. Hopefully we'll have time to get to most of them. And given my personal experiences being a part of the More Than a Single Story series, and having listened to many of those conversations, I know that we're in for a treat, especially with this work that is so timely, and I think tells not just a local story of Minneapolis, but a story for the world. With that, I will hand it over. Robin, I think you were going to do a little bit more. Is that correct? And then,
yeah, thank you, Clarence, and thank you everybody for being here. I want to thank the Eastside Freedom Library and the Roseville Library from Ramsey County Libraries for being co-hosts with us tonight. Please consider supporting the Ramsey County Historical Society and the Eastside Freedom Library. We rely on the support of members and friends like you to continue to present these programs and all of our efforts. And there are some great benefits to joining RCHS, including our wonderful quarterly magazine Ramsey County History, and admission to Gibbs Farm, and a lot of other things. You can find out more about RCHS on our website, including, as Clarence mentioned, all of our upcoming programs, how to join or donate, and membership benefits, and much more. The address is www.rchs.com, and I'm going to share a screen real quick. There we go. And again, please check out the Eastside Freedom Library and the Roseville Library. There's wonderful programs, both organizations, and they appreciate your support. As a reminder, everyone, can you please keep your microphones and personal cameras turned off during the program? You can type your questions and comments in the chat, as Clarence mentioned, and we'll read those out after the official presentation. The program is being recorded and will be up on our RCHS and the Eastside Freedom Library YouTube channels in a few days. The Ramsey County Historical Society would like to acknowledge the sacred Dakota land, Minnesota Makoche, the land where the waters are so clear they reflect the clouds, is the ancestral and contemporary homeland of the Dakota people. It is also home to the Anishinaabe and other indigenous peoples. The Ramsey County Historical Society acknowledges that its sites are located on and benefit from these sacred Dakota lands. Ramsey County Historical Society is committed to preserving our past, informing our present, and inspiring our future. Part of doing so is acknowledging the painful history and current challenges facing the Dakota people, just as we celebrate the contributions of Dakota and other indigenous peoples. You can find our full land acknowledgement statement on our website, www.rchs.com. And this full statement includes actionable ways in which RCHS pledges to honor the Dakota and other indigenous peoples of Minnesota Makoche. We are committed to presenting the stories and histories of all in our community, and we're so pleased to bring you tonight's wonderful program. In 2022, all of our partners are working to bring you programs focused on our new series, Making Minnesota, which will explore the often untold stories, histories, and experiences of some of the worldwide immigrant, African American, and Indigenous communities that make up Ramsey County, our most diverse county. On January 20th at 7 o'clock, we have another very special History Revealed with Bill Lindekeith on the history of St. Paul, which is going to be part of our Making Minnesota series. This will also be online, and see our website for registration and more details. I want to thank our panelists tonight. I'm so excited to have everyone here tonight. First of all, Carolyn Holbrook is the founder and director of More Than a Single Story, as well as the founder of SASE, The Right Place. She is a writer, educator, and an advocate for the healing power of the arts. Her essay collection, Tell Me Your Names and I Will Testify, received the Minnesota Book Award for Memoir and Creative Nonfiction. She is co-author of Dr. Josie Johnson's memoir, Hope in the Struggle, which is a great book. And her essays have been published widely in A Good Time for the Truth, Race in Minnesota, and also in Blues Vision, African American Writing from Minnesota, as well as many other publications. Carolyn was the first person of color to win the Kay Sexton Award from the Minnesota Book Awards and the Friends of St. Paul Public Libraries for contributions to Minnesota literature, and was a 50 over 50 honoree in 2016. Then we also have co-editor David Mura, who has written 10 books, including the memoirs Turning Japanese, a New York Times notable book, Where the Body Meets Memory, and 4 poetry collections. After We Lost Our Way, a National Poetry Contest winner, The Colors of Desire, which received the Carl Sandburg Award, Angels for Burning, The Last Incantations, and A Stranger's Journey, Race, Identity, and Narrative Craft and Writing. He teaches at VONA, a writers conference for writers of color, and has worked with Alexis Pate's Innocent Classroom, a program designed to improve relationships between teachers and students of color. Suleiman Aden is a writer, educator, and grassroots organizer in the Twin Cities. He works as a program manager. That's an older one. He is a capacity building director at Team Dynamics, and he was a program manager with Reading and Math Inc. and is also a Quran, Arabic, and Islamic studies teacher at the Northwest Islamic Community Center in Plymouth, Minnesota. He is a project manager and board chair for the Global Alliance of Muslims for Equality, an international NGO. Another panelist, Marcy Rendon, is a white Earth citizen. Her book, Girl Gone Missing, is second in the Cash Black Bear series, was nominated for the Sue Grafton Memorial Award in 2020. Murder on the Red River received the Pinkley Woman's Debut Crime Novel Award in 2018 and was a Western Writers of America Spur Award finalist also in 2018. Sinister Graves, third in the Cash Black Bear series, will be published in 2022. Rendon has children's books, plays, short stories, and poetry published, including a script, Sweet Revenge, which had a stage reading at the Playwright Center in partnership with the Guthrie in 2021. Marcy also received the 2020 McKnight Distinguished Artist Award to honor a Minnesota artist who's made significant contributions to the state's cultural life. She has curated Twin Cities Public Television's Art is Creative Native Resilience 2019. Diego Vasquez and Rendon received the 2017 Spoken Word Immersion Fellowship for work with incarcerated women. Kevin Yang is among American multidisciplinary artist from the Twin Cities with a focus on spoken word poetry and documentary filmmaking. He currently works at Twin Cities PBS and is a board member with Street Stops and Mountaintops. Kevin finds most of his artistic inspiration unraveling his Hmong American experience with others. And I want to mention that the book, We Are Meant to Rise, which is a wonderful book, is available at our partner Subtext Books, which is at subtextbooks.com. And we'll put a link in the chat for a direct link to their website for tonight's title. So again, thank you all for being here. Please put your questions in the chat and I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. Thank you, Caroline, David, and everyone.
Carolyn,
Caroline,
you're
you're
muted.
muted.
Sorry. All right. All right. So thank you, Robin, for that wonderful introduction. And many thanks to Eastside Freedom Library and the Ramsey County Historical Society for inviting us to be your first presenters for this year's Making Minnesota series. The essays and poems in We Are Meant to Rise certainly do explore some of the untold stories, histories, and experiences of our diverse communities. Thanks also to everyone who is here tonight to share this evening's event with us. Special thanks to the University of Minnesota Press for working with More Than a Single Story to publish this anthology, and to the 33 writers who lent their voices to this effort, including Marcy Rendon, Suleiman Aden, and Kevin Yang, who are with David and me tonight. More Than a Single Story is a Twin Cities-based conversation series where Black, Indigenous, and people of color writers and arts activists hold public discussions on issues of importance to us. Our goal is to provide a forum that strengthens our abilities to work together around cross-cultural understanding and to add to the discussions of empowerment in and for our communities. Please see our website, sign up for our newsletter, and keep up with our upcoming events, both around the book and our regular conversation series. I'm just gonna, our communications director just put our website in the chat. Thanks, Jua. We are moving into our 7th year now, and 2 years ago, I mentioned to my editor at the University of Minnesota Press that I'd been thinking about putting together an anthology to celebrate our first 5 years. And he loved the idea because, as Clarence White mentioned a little while ago, we've been having some very, very rich conversations. And we thought that, we could compile some of those and, get some of the writers who'd been involved in our first 5 years to participate in the writing of this anthology. And early in our history, I invited David Mura into More Than a Single Story to develop and moderate conversations centering on the experiences of BIPOC men. And I am so honored that he also agreed to co-edit this amazing anthology with me. So again, our original idea was to invite writers who had participated in the first 5 years, but then the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd changed that. In the actual publication, we do experience the pandemic and the killing of George Floyd and its aftermath, from the point of view of some of us who are grappling with those life-shattering events. But the book also contains essays and poems, excuse me, about loss, about family, about food culture, economic security, mental health, and other issues as well. The voices in our book reflect the variety of BIPOC writers in Minnesota, from authors with international reputations to newly emerging voices, and voices from many cultures, including Indigenous Dakota and Ojibwe, African American, Hmong, Somali, Afghani, Lebanese, Korean, Vietnamese, Japanese, Puerto Rican, Colombian, Mexican, transracial adoptees, mixed race people, LGBTQ people, and people with disabilities. So tonight, Marcy, Suleiman, and Kevin are going to read from their work in the book, and then we will have a conversation. But before we begin, David has a few words as well.
Carolyn's series, More Than a Single Story, is a tremendous series, and I want to thank Carolyn for inviting me to be part of it, and then inviting me to be part of this wonderful anthology, and to be, to help her co-edit it. It's been a great honor, and I am pleased and amazed at what the writers wrote back. It is an incredibly diverse, incredibly powerful anthology. In the More Than Single Story series, there's always a poem which opens. So I'm going to read a poem by Robert Hayden, which really reminds Suleiman's essay, The Little Brown Briefcase, reminds me of this poem, because it's about the sacrifices, the untold or unspoken sacrifices that parents often make for their children. So this is by the great Robert Hayden. It's called Those Winter Sundays. Sundays, too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Then with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather, made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house. Speaking indifferently to him, who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? I'm going to read from the introduction a little bit. And I think it's fitting that we're working with the Ramsey County Historical Society. So this is the end of the introduction, and it talks about history. And 2020, which is recorded in many of the essays in the anthology, this anthology is now a historical document. In their own ways, all the writers in this collection are witnesses to history, whether it be the more recent history of 2020 or the histories of their communities within the American story. Too often our American story has been told from a single viewpoint, a viewpoint that diminished or occluded or silenced the history and voices of Black and Indigenous people, of people of color. In order to truly understand what we have been as a country, who we are now, and who we are becoming, we need voices like those of the writers here. Still, the question remains. Out of so many different voices, out of such diversity, how do we form a common vision? How do we come together to create a society that is truly democratic and truly just, that provides a space and opportunity for all of us to thrive To address this complicated question, I want to end with a passage on identity by the great African-American writer, James Baldwin. The question of identity is a question involving the most profound panic, a terror as primary as a nightmare of the mortal fall. This question can scarcely be said to exist among the wretched who know merely that they are wretched and who bear it day by day. It is a mistake to suppose the wretched do not know they are wretched. Nor does this question exist among the splendid who know merely that they are splendid and who flaunt it day by day. It is a mistake to suppose that the splendid have any intention of surrendering their splendor. An identity is questioned only when it is menaced, as when the mighty begin to fall, or the wretched begin to rise, or when the stranger enters the gates. Never thereafter to be a stranger, the stranger's presence making you the stranger, less to the stranger than to yourself. Identity would seem to be the garment with which one covers the nakedness of the self, in which case it is best that the garment be loose, a little like the robes of the desert, through which robes one's nakedness can always be felt and sometimes discerned. This trust in one's nakedness is all that gives one the power to change one's robes. Now that's the end of the quotation. From America's inception, the confrontation between white settlers and Native Americans, between white slave owners and their Black slaves, have engendered questions of identity, of who we are as a nation. And now for many, each day in America, a stranger walks into our village, or we are a stranger walking into someone else's village. The appearance of the stranger, Baldwin maintains, challenges our own way of looking at our village. But at the same time, the stranger also looks at us differently from the way we see ourselves. And thus, we must question our identity, as we have not done before. Again, as Baldwin says, this can be a terrifying proposition. And it certainly was for the indigenous people who resided in America when confronted with colonizers who took the land and wanted to exterminate them. But our present day encounters with our fellow Americans can involve a very different process. We can look at the stranger as a fellow human being, a fellow traveler, a fellow American. We can choose to learn from the stranger, learn a different language, a different culture, a different history. And we can comfort ourselves by the fact that this process has always been occurring in America. And in so many cases, such encounters and exchanges they have catalyzed have only made us stronger, more resilient, more creative and innovative, more capable of making connections with the rest of the world outside of America. That is, we let the stranger into our village, into our nation, and indeed, into our hearts. Several years ago, I was asked by The Nation magazine to write on Minnesota for an anthology of writers commenting on their states. Back in the 1920s, The Nation did a similar anthology, and Sinclair Lewis, the Nobel Prize-winning novelist from Sauk Center, wrote about Minnesota. In his essay, Lewis commented on the quote-unquote, the strange new immigrants, the Swedes. Diversity is our strength. Each new speaker who becomes part of America is our strength. The writers in this anthology provide us with individual portraits of who we are, and in doing so, they can help us to know each other, our neighbors, our fellow citizens. The writers prove here we are indeed more than a single story.
Okay.
So now it's Suleiman who read.
Yeah, Suleiman. We can find him. Yes, there you are.
Well, folks, thank you so much, David and Carolyn. It only takes a smell, a picture, a random memory to bring me back to my childhood. A childhood that was immersed in hardship. Now, I don't want folks to think I had a sad or even a miserable childhood. My mom made sure that my two sisters and I were always content. The earliest memory I have of knowing that we were poor was when I was in the 6th grade. It was 2006, and our lights got cut off. Now, this wasn't a new thing. Our lights would get cut off here and there. But this was the first time I saw my mom look very worried. Usually, what we would do is fill the entire house with candles and pull out our portable DVD player and binge watch movies together as a family. However, this time, instead of filling the house with candles, we gathered all the extension cords we could find in the house and connected them together, creating a snake-like cord throughout the house. We then went outside to the next door house that was not yet sold yet and still under construction, and found the outlet outside their house. Plugged it in, and instantly the house came to life again. I rubbed my hands together, trying to warm them. The leaves were beginning to fall. Autumn in Minnesota, my favorite season. I took a deep breath, walked back into the house through the back door. This instance was the first time I knew I was poor. This isn't to say that I wasn't poor before, just that now I knew I was poor. A strange feeling indeed, having such a realization in that matter. My mom is the most hardworking woman I know. A Somali immigrant. My mother worked as long as I can remember. Like many children who were raised in poverty, I knew the value of money early on. I was indoctrinated at a very young age. I was also taught about the system. Growing up, I knew about that system, or the system was that it made my mom stress out at the beginning of every month. Papers that she would frequently collect and keep safe. We children weren't even allowed to touch them. In a small brown briefcase under her bed, she kept those documents. It wasn't until I was much older that I understood that the entirety of our family's financial history and security was housed in that little brown briefcase. Now, as an adult, I too house all my financial records in a small briefcase under my bed. Now, did I do this deliberately, or did I spend so much time growing up seeing my mom's documents in that briefcase that I thought that financial security was only attained by the aid of a brown briefcase? I honestly don't know. I am still working to figure out what financial security means. Do I even qualify for this American dream? I think about this sometimes. How I will escape the clutches of poverty. Now, I don't mean I'm poor like many children of immigrants. Our goal in life was to go to college so we could have jobs that could provide for our families. You may have escaped poverty, however, poverty is still very much a part of your life. Something that I had not realized about living in poverty was the impact it had on one's mental health. I think about the state of my mom's mental health, working nearly 7 days a week and raising 3 kids by herself. What her mind must have been going through as she had to calculate how she would use her EBT so she could stretch it throughout the entire month. What were her dreams like? Did she look forward to sleep as an escape from reality? Or did she dread it? She often told me that she was overwhelmed by financial hardships to recount dreams. Now imagine that. Imagine a life without dreaming, sleep, acting, only as a reboot to tackle the day ahead. Dreams are supposed to be one of the very few guaranteed experiences humans have, but they were a luxury for her. How do those like my mom do it? Those who came to this country with next to nothing and still have next to nothing. How do they find the will to continue on, knowing that it is a hole that is nearly impossible to escape from? How do they continue to be selfless and want to give more than they receive? Something my mom would say was, we have a home, food in the fridge, and love in our home. Should we not help those so they can have that too? To me, that was truly astonishing. This mantra that my mom held is what I now live with my life by. How can I say no to help those who ask for help? Or there's a saying that my mom would always say, no one has ever gone poor by giving. An astonishing mindset given her personal life and financial circumstances. There's one thing that I would tell children of immigrants is to have the mindset that my mom had, to give selflessly and to truly want for others what you want for yourself. Sometimes we, and as we, I mean children of immigrants, are quick to forget where we came from. Not the actual location, but who we came from, who raised us, and what they had to go through to ensure that we didn't need to endure what they endured. I would hate it when my mom would always tell me to become a doctor. You know, there was no other career path that she would accept other than a doctor. It wasn't until now that I realized that she knew that she could not offer generational wealth to help me as I navigate through life. However, she could offer a mindset, a lifestyle, an idea that can result in my becoming the beginning of generational wealth for my family. Now, I may not want to go back to school to study medicine. However, I can continue to strive to climb the ladder of the American dream and lay the foundation for generational wealth. But with one caveat, that my children and my family will continue to live by the mantra that my mother taught us: to give selflessly, to help others, and to always be grateful for what you have. Thank you.
Mm. Oh my goodness, thank you so much, Suleiman. I'm always struck by the power of that brief little essay, Little Brown Briefcase. Thank you so much. Marcy, would you like to go next, please?
Bonjour. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Bonjour, Awanakwe Indigenous Cause, Migazi Ni Dode, Gawababi Gani Kagandunjba. My Indian name is Awanakwe. I am Eagle Clan, and I am from the White Earth Nation in northern Minnesota. While we're doing this gathering tonight, services have started for Clyde Belcourt, who was one of the founders of the American Indian movement, who passed away earlier this week, and he will be going home to White Earth. I believe tomorrow is when they're taking him up there. And, you know, I think that my adult life was shaped by the American Indian movement. And the radicalness of the American Indian movement, which has shaped and formed and made so many, created so much awareness among non-Native people, and then for us who grew up during that time of the movement. You know, and I guess one thing that I want to say is that, you know, like AIM has always shown up for all people's struggles here in the Twin Cities. I remember when I think it was 28, I went to New York. It was the first time that I ever went to New York City. And I literally met people who did not believe that Native people still existed. They really had bought into that whole belief that we were all killed off. And I remember riding on the plane home and saying to one of the women who had gone with us that the next time I saw Clyde, I was gonna just give him a great big hug and kiss, because at least here in Minneapolis, Native people exist. And that's a direct result of the work that the American Indian movement did, continue to do. And, you know, Clyde was, he was the last of the founders. All the other founders of the American Indian movement have already passed on. So he's one of the last of the original ones. So I wanted to say that before I read the piece that I actually wrote for the book. You know, when George Floyd and the city was burning, and the, you know, like AIM showed up and Native people showed up, and that part of the city that burned is Indian country. Anyways, so then I'll just read a short part of the piece that's in this book. Healers are protectors, protectors are healers. I am an Anishinaabe woman. I joke and say, this is not our first pandemic, and it certainly isn't our first war. From smallpox to the Spanish flu to tuberculosis and government medical experiments, the sterilization of Native women, and now COVID-19, Native people have survived it all. European folks arrived on the eastern shores with weapons we had never seen, and from day one, we were target practice. Anishinaabe people had clan structures in place prior to European invasion. The clan systems assured the protection, health, and well-being of our people. This clan system for our people is centuries old. It existed prior to our Great Migration. It is told in story that the Anishinaabe people used to live on the eastern seaboard. An elder had a vision of food that grew on water, and he led people on a journey from the east to Madeline Island, where wild rice was found growing around Lake Superior. The people brought the teachings of the 7 clans with them. The 7 clans are fish, marten, bear, deer, crane, loon, and bird. If I remember right, Clyde is Loon Clan. In recent times, the eagle and wolf clans are also recognized. Cranes and loons are leaders, having different roles. Fish are thinkers and mediators. Martens are warriors. Birds are spiritual leaders, and deer are peacemakers. Bear clan are both police, protectors, and healers. The clans are kept alive by a living story, told in ceremony and community storytelling. Imagine a world where the police, the protectors, and healers are one. Miigwech.
Yes, another powerful essay, and many, many thanks to Clyde Bellecourt and AIM Patrol. It was so wonderful to see them at the George Floyd uprisings. And thank you, Marcy, for writing this beautiful essay. Kevin Yang will go next.
Good evening, everyone. Grateful for the two, for Suleiman and Marcy for sharing your stories tonight, and grateful for everyone for coming out tonight and listening to these stories that are so important. I'll be reading some excerpts for my story. The first time I read another Hmong voice in literature was in my 12th grade English class. We were in a unit covering the things they carried by Tim O'Brien, and my English teacher had the wherewithal to assign a reading that included voices that weren't just white. I remember reading a poem from the teacher's selection and feeling shook. I can't remember the name of the poem, but I remember how it made me feel. Reading Hmong words and Hmong experiences that resonated with me in ways no other piece of literature had ever done before. I immediately raised my hand and gushed on and on about how important the poem was to me. It was only about 12 lines long. The class moved quickly to the next subject, but after class, my teacher sensed how important this moment was for me and insisted that I read a poem, a book called Real Karaoke People by a Minnesota poet by the name of Ed Bockley. I remember taking the poems home and devouring them over and over again during Christmas break. The audacity of the language, the sharpness of the narratives, the voice I heard echoed in my head. It cut so deep and so close, hearing the complexities of what it meant to be a Korean American. I joined the speech team during my senior year of high school. The way that my category worked was I had to find a published poem that was about 7 minutes long and perform it. And the poem I chose was The Secret to Life in America by Ed Bockley, from the very book that I had just spent an entire 2 weeks consuming. I laid the poem out on white printed paper and glued it onto the back of thick black construction paper, and for weeks did everything I could to memorize the words, repeating the beginning lines over and over again. My brother sits me down and tells me the secret to life in America. I'm 12 years old when this happens. He grabs my shoulder and says, no one likes an immigrant. It reminds them when they fell down and no one was around to help them. For 3 months, I did my best to embody the poem at every competition I performed at. And in many of these competitions, I was the only person of color in the room, performing in front of mostly all white audiences in tiny rural towns across the state of Minnesota, performing a poem about a young boy trying to make sense of the contradictions of being Asian and an immigrant in this country. I remember searching for Ed Bockley on the internet and finding a video of him performing the poem, and that I had spent 3 months just carrying. There was a certain rhythm to this poem that I would learn was called slam poetry and spoken word. I continued searching online for these new ideas and finding videos of other Asian American poets creating work that blew me away, like Bao Phi, Bo Xia, and Kelly Tsai. Their work was fierce, sharp, and such an authentic reflection of their identities, and I knew almost immediately that this is what I wanted to do. As an Asian American and a Hmong American, I find few opportunities to see myself reflected, not just positively, but authentically by mainstream media and literature. And it was a reminder of how important it is for communities to tell their own stories on their own terms. And it left me hungry to create my work and further tell my stories using this medium new to me. At many points in my life, when I was struggling with something, I'd ask myself, how can I turn this feeling into a poem? The past few years of my life have been a reminder that I can't art away all of my problems. I still struggle with anxiety and self-esteem and sharing my feelings, but I've been finding new ways to take care of myself. I started going to therapy for the first time, trying to process my traumas and eager to learn how I can show up as a more authentic and healthy version of myself in my relationships. I'm in a loving relationship with a partner who reminds me to be the best version of myself, that I'm worthy of love and capable of sharing that love back. I don't perform as much as I used to, but I know that this art still lives within me, and I'm grateful for all it's done for me. I'm alive because of it. Thank you.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Kevin. It's just so amazing to have watched you become that fierce artist in the vein of those that came before you that you mentioned. Thank you. I'm going to turn it back to David. He has some questions to start our conversation with.
Yes, thank you, Kevin, Carolyn, Suleiman, and Marcy. Kevin's piece really speaks to the importance of an anthology like this, because children need to feel that their lives, their experiences, who they are reflected in the culture around them. And for many of us, when we were growing up, that wasn't the case. What I also love about Kevin's piece is that he references Ed Bockley, and Ed Bockley, I put in the chat, has an essay that opens the anthology, his essay is entitled Pandemic Love. This event is organized and co-sponsored by the Ramsey County Historical Society and Eastside Freedom Library. So I'm going to ask, my first two questions are, the first one is going to relate to history, and the second is to the work of the Eastside Freedom Library. So first, with the Ramsey County Historical Society, it's about history. And BIPOC writers were always contending, when we're contending with our issues about our identity, our community, we're also invoking history. I'm third generation Japanese American. My grandfather came here in 1898, which was the year of Plessy v. Ferguson, the year of the Wilmington Massacre. And it also says that my family's been here since the 19th century, and people still ask me where I'm from. My grandparents were forbidden for becoming citizens. Both my parents' families were interned during World War II in the internment camps. So my writing covers these areas and these subjects. So for the writers, and we'll just go in the same order again, and then I want to involve Carolyn also in this question. Can you talk about your own personal history in Minnesota and anything you might want to provide about the history of your particular ethnic and racial community? I also want to add as a context a quotation from the German critic Walter Benjamin, who said that history is the tale of the victors. As a BIPOC writer, what does history mean to you? Do you think at all about the fact that your writing has become a part of a history, a witness to these times? So the question is just, what role does history play in your work? What do you want to tell us about the history of yourself and in Minnesota and the history of your community? So let's start with Suleiman.
Hi there. Thank you, David. So I'm ethnically Somali. My parents specifically came here in '96. I was born in '96, and I came here about when I was 5 months old. My story is very similar to a lot of Somali immigrants, where their parents or they themselves fled civil war, and found themselves in a refugee camp in a neighboring country. And then
For some reason, Suleiman, we've lost your voice. I don't know.
oh, can you
Now
can
it's
you hear me
back.
okay now?
It's back now.
Okay, sorry about that. But as I was saying, my story is a lot similar to those who have they themselves escaped civil war in Somalia. My family, for some of the writers in this group I know personally, I grew up in South Minneapolis, about 5 blocks from where George Floyd was murdered on Chicago Ave, and I lived there for the vast majority of my life. And as for my people, they've come here. They've been here since the '90s, and I see that they have found themselves in really putting themselves in the mores of society in this country and in Minnesota. You see them in almost every facet of society as writers, as teachers, educators, engineers, doctors. But one thing that I really do appreciate of the Somali people is the always coming back to their roots. Historically, we are a poetic people. In the history books of old, you will find that the Somalis in Somalia were referred to as the land of the poets. Even within my own immediate family, there are folks in my extended family. We have folks back before the Civil War, war poets in Somalia. And it is not uncommon that at family gatherings pre-pandemic, that we would have folks give what in Somali is called gabe, but small poems from their favorite Somali poets or ones that they wrote themselves in the Somali language. Now, the youngsters may not know what the folks are talking about in those poems because it's in a vernacular or the vocabulary used in the poems are kind of high, not the everyday speak that we use, but it hits the heart nonetheless. The second part of your question about what does history mean to me, as a Somali American myself, history is always oral. Till this day, there are archaeologists that are in Somalia trying to locate the written history of Somalis. A lot of it is not there because we pass down traditions orally, even till this day, from our elders to their children and children onward. I myself have a daughter who's 5 months old. She can't understand anything. However, I still, when I'm rocking her down back to sleep, I tell her the stories of her people, her ancestors, what they have accomplished and what they're up to, because the stories live within us. And then as for that last part, do I think about the fact that my writing has become a part of history, a witness to the times? I think it's a witness to those who are willing to see it. Just like a lot of things that are happening in the world around us, things are happening, injustices are happening. Some folks choose, make a conscious decision to be a witness for it, and others don't. And I think that's where us as writers come in. There was once a time when our writing was enough to speak volumes, but I think now it goes hand in hand. Our voice, our physical voice, in spaces like this, when we're able to actually put voice to the words, and coupling that with our pens, both have mites.
Great, thank you so much, Suleiman. Marcy, you want to talk about this question, just your history in Minnesota, the history of your community? Yeah, and you just spoke so eloquently about Clyde Bellecourt and the witness to the history of AIM. So if you could just keep going, you know, and also because your essay is so much about history. So just say whatever you want here.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of feel at a loss for words in general, just because this is such a, like the whole community at this point is aware of Clyde's passing, and there's, just a lot of sorrow, a lot of grief. I think what's important, as I listen to what people have read and what people have already said tonight, one of the things that I'm always conscious of is that when new immigrants, new people come to this continent, you're not taught whose land you're coming to. This is Dakota people's country, and the Dakota were exiled. People learn about Abraham Lincoln and freeing the slaves, but they're not taught that, right after issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, he ordered the hanging of the 38 Dakota down here at Mankato, and that it's still on the law books that the Dakota are supposed to be exiled from the state of Minnesota. So, like those things haven't changed. And then the people just aren't taught the history of what the attempted genocide for us as Native people. I guess one of the things that I was thinking too is that, like, there are no living victims of genocide, and I think that that is one of the powerful things that, the idea of sovereignty for us as Native people, that we're still here, we never disappeared. And it was our elders, it was, people who kept those stories alive and kept the teachings alive so that we would still have access to them today. I don't see my writing as like writing history. What I'm trying to do in my writing is write so that Native people see themselves, that other people see that we still exist, that we're not something or somebody in the past, but that we're here today. And for people to have just an accurate picture of who we are. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Marcy. Kevin?
Great, thank you. I think about this question a lot. Oftentimes when I read about Hmong folks outside of the context of the circles that I'm usual usually in, there's always like a first paragraph that is tacked onto the article, or a paragraph tacked to the very end that gives a brief history of Hmong people in 50 words, and in so many ways about how striking that is. I think about the history of our people. It stretches back so many years, but of us sort of trying to find our concept of home, whether it's in a place like China where we had to migrate and leave from, or places like Laos where we had to leave during the war. And that's the story of my mother and father who came to the United States in 1979, fleeing the war in Southeast Asia and the war in Laos. I think about that often, and about how resilient we are, and about how movement has always been a part of how I understand our story, this constant search for home, and also this concept that we're making home wherever we stand. We're making home with each other, and I think there's something powerful about that. In terms of the Twin Cities, I like you shared, Suleiman. I grew up in South Minneapolis. I've lived here for the first 12 years of my life, and actually not too far away, also from George Floyd Square. And I moved up to the northern suburbs when I started middle school. And I talked a little bit about that in my story. But when I started college, I went to school in St. Paul, and I think that's significant in my understanding of being Hmong, because it was one of the first times where I was surrounded by a community among folks who were artists, politicians, regular Hmong folks, but just I found a community among folks and really re-understood my identity as a Hmong person in a really powerful way, and I'm really, really grateful for that. And it really expanded how I understood what it meant to be Hmong. But in terms of history, art has always been such a large part of how I understand history. Hmong folks have been, like Suleiman shared too, the oral tradition has been such an important part of how we share our history for one another, telling stories. Traditions and practices like Kutsia and Baho have always been ways of us sharing our past and our histories, even the clothes that we wear, our beautiful textiles, things like Bando. Legends say that that's our text, our language, our alphabet written right into our clothes, so that we could keep it alive during these moments of migration, of conflict, of survival. And I find a lot of power in that as an artist, trying to see my art as a part of that process. So I really keep that alive too, in the work that I do. As a documentary maker too, I find really, I'm really interested in these, in this concept of, well, oftentimes, especially with young people, we often see history as this thing that's really far away from us. But we carry living history within us too. And I find a lot of strength in that, especially when I think about my own history growing up and about these moments of survival that were different from the moments of survival that my parents had to go through growing up. But there were moments of survival nonetheless, surviving racism, surviving poverty in this country, and the difficulties, but also the moments of joy, of humor, and creativity that we had to figure out in order to survive. And I think a lot of my art centers around that. So I think that's my answer to the question.
Thank you. Carolyn, you want to talk about history in your piece and your work?
Yeah, I think it's pretty well known that African Americans have lived in Minnesota at least since the 1800s. The first known Black man to live in Minnesota was a man named George Bunga, who was a fur trader and was married to an Ojibwe woman, or his mother was Ojibwe rather. My family, as far as I know, has been here since about the 20s or 30s as part of the African American Great Migration. And we've mostly lived in Minneapolis, though some of us still do live in St. Cloud as well. Most of my family lives in South Minneapolis. again, like Suleiman and Kevin, we grew up right around the George Floyd Square. Some of my family also lived in the Seven Corners area. My cousin, Dr. Joseph White, known as the father of Black psychology, was one of the first Blacks to graduate from De La Salle High School. My stepfather was the first Black auditor for the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. He was also a jazz musician. And together, he and my mother opened several beauty salons and the first and only African-American beauty school in the state of Minnesota. My mother actually started the cosmetology program in the Minneapolis public schools that's still going on today. As a writer, I want these histories that we're hearing tonight and the histories, the stories of Black people to be known in the forms of literary writing as well as the wonderful historical writing that people like Dr. Bill Green and other historians and sociologists are writing. So I'm always just grateful again and again for our being able to publish this anthology and and some of the other writings that are coming out that are, do I want to say more accessible than academic writing? So I'll stop there.
Okay, I will just say a little, one connection that my family has to Minnesota is that my uncle, Tad, was in the military intelligence service and studied the Japanese language at Fort Snelling during World War II. And recently, last May, and I'll put up a link to this, Twin Cities Public Television, I worked with them to do a documentary about these soldiers. And they served, as translators, as interrogators, as code breakers. And MacArthur's chief of intelligence said that they shortened the war in the Pacific by 2 years and saved probably 1 million American lives. And many of them did this while they were imprisoned by the United States government, like my parents' family were. And they were keenly aware of the irony of this, and yet their efforts were instrumental to the war in the Pacific, just like, I think more people know about the Navajo code breakers because of the movie. So I urge everybody to look at the documentary Armed with Language by Twin Cities Public Television, and I'll put up a link to that in the chat. My second question comes out of the important and wonderful work the Eastside Library, Freedom Library, has been doing for many years, supporting local writers and activists, acting as a center for community activities. So my question is about the conjunction of writing and politics and social activism. I've always said that when BIPOC writers articulate their own experiences and stories, they are both freeing themselves and others. And again, Kevin's piece is an example of this. I'm wondering how each of you writers view your own writings in terms of the struggle for freedom and justice, and in terms of the effect of your writing on yourself and others. So this is about, how you feel your writing relates to the issues of freedom and social justice, and whether you see this as something conscious that you're doing with your writing, or something that just comes out of your writing. So let's go reverse, and I'm going to ask Carolyn to speak on this first.
Well, I've always said that I wanted my writing to add to the voices of others who are writing about Blacks in Minnesota. The wonderful anthology that Alex Pate, Pamela Fletcher, and J. Otis Powell edited a few years ago, Blues Vision, African American Writings from Minnesota, is a great example of stories, poems, and essays about Black life here in the past 100 years. Before that, there was an anthology titled The Butterfly Tree that was published maybe 20, 30 years ago. I can't even remember now. That also began to, focus on stories of Black life here in Minnesota. And it's always, there's, what am I trying to say here? There's so much more to our stories than people know. And it's just, for me, just vitally important that we continue to tell our stories, and not only for the public consumption, but also for the way, the healing power that they have on us to be able to write and tell our stories, whether it's in poetry or memoir or songs or fiction or documentaries, or however you do it. So yeah, it's and I want to also thank the Eastside Freedom Library for the work that you are doing to bring all these stories forth. I'll stop there.
Okay, Kevin, you want to go?
Yep, absolutely. I once again I write about this in my book. I think the act of reading other writers and sort of the concept of windows and mirrors of seeing my story reflected and seeing others who not only look like me but have stories that are similar in ways that had never been before. It was almost like a physical experience. I could feel my body perking up in my mind and my heart, saying like, this is right. And I think that's such a powerful thing, especially in the past couple of years too. Seeing a multitude of folks in mainstream media, whether it be in the big screen, Asian American filmmakers and writers making really amazing work that tell our stories in complex ways. The inspiration behind, for example, the entire work that all of y'all are doing with More Than a Single Story, really giving us a deeper understanding and sense of our identity and being able to process that, I think is really powerful. And understanding our history too. I talked about earlier about how often I read a story about Hmong folks, and there'll be that first paragraph talking about putting all of our existences into the context of the war that happened and how important it is to remember that history, but also realizing that there's other history happening around us. I think a lot about the mundane moments whenever I try to tell our history. Mundane moments of intersection that might often get forgotten when the only thing we know about Hmong people is that first paragraph, and about how happy I feel when I'm able to enter into conversation or experience work about Hmong folks that pushes beyond that first paragraph. For example, I'm on a project right now where we're telling the mishaps and the joys and the humors of working as a Hmong community in the nonprofit industrial complex, and all the fun little things that happen between the intersections of Hmong life and the intersections of nonprofit life, and weird little things like that. I think about experiences growing up, for example, like eating hot dogs and rice for breakfast, and weird little experiences like that. These moments that folks might not see as grand history, but to me are moments that I laugh at, that really help me connect with a certain generation and how we survived. I think that's like a really a type of history that I really found myself attracted to and trying to spotlight, because I think there's a lot of power to that when we're able to move beyond that paragraph just at the beginning of our stories, and really deepen and complicate the way that we tell and understand our Hmong identity.
Thanks, Kevin. I want to say that teriyaki hot dogs and rice was one of my favorite childhood dishes. And I'll occasionally make it, and my wife will just be appalled at it. Marcy, can you address this question of social activism, justice, freedom, and the act of writing?
Well, I want to echo what Carolyn said about appreciating the Eastside Freedom Library, and that place being a place where voices can be heard and put out into the larger community. The way that I think and the way that I was taught is that as a Native person, my existence is political. The fact that I exist is a political statement. The fact that I exist, it's a spiritual statement. And that anything that we write, anything that I write is, political and spiritual. Mostly what I'm trying to do is, like when I write, my audience is the Native community. And, I hope that other people enjoy it. I hope that other people learn something from it or whatever. But my real goal is to be like a conduit or a mirror for other Native people to see themselves and and that we exist in the present. I guess that is just such a key piece of everything that I try to do, is that we are here. We never left. We never disappeared. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcy. Suleiman?
Hi. Yes. Thank you so much, David. One point that comes to me time and time again, I mentioned this in previous discussions, is by a quote from a book by Matthew Desmond called Evicted, that towards the end of the book, he mentions that it takes an average about 10 generations to escape the cycle of poverty. And then when I read that the first time, I immediately felt hopeless. And so did a lot of folks that I know who read just that statement. And how it relates to my piece is that not only for myself, but folks in my family who I see, living in this system called poverty, trying their best to itch and climb their way out, but this system that was created to hold them down, time and time again, closing that door, locking that door, barricading that door that they want to escape from. Every time I reflect upon it, every time I reflect upon their struggles, I reflect upon that quote, that statistic. I personally turned to writing. For me, thinking about my childhood, growing up in poverty, thinking about what I went through, what my family goes through, what I still go through. For me, writing is the only way that I was able to articulate, or I still am able to only articulate how exactly I feel. And being able to not essentially share the stories of those who can't speak for themselves, rather giving them the microphone so that they can share the stories for themselves. That's why for the past few years, I've been holding free workshops, free classes for inner city kids from the same neighborhood that I grew up in, to write about the experiences they go through. That not essentially, like I mentioned before, it's not that I'm the one writing their stories. Hey, Jimmy's going through this, Derek's going through this, Wayne's going through this. Rather, it's, hey, you want a platform to write, you want to have the necessary tools and experience and know how to write. Here, come here, I'll teach you, and you tell your own story. So when you had asked about freedom and justice, I think there's nothing really free in this country. Maybe for a subset of people, but you have folks that in this country, in the state, that try to do the best that they can do, and yet, like I mentioned, doors are closed, locked, and barricaded. And writing is really the only way for them, first and foremost, a self-soothing, therapeutic way to speak about any injustices that they feel like they may be going through. But in hopes that their writing can inspire others to act And we've seen it time and time again in history. How many times have writing and writing pieces started rebellions, a cause of revolution, even in the age of mass media and social media. We see it time and time again.
Great, thank you, Sulima. I wonder, do you know about 826 Minneapolis?
I do.
Okay, so have you done anything with them? This is
I
an
had.
826 Minneapolis, let me explain, is an organization which does creative writing and tutoring for marginalized populations, and it's located right in South Minneapolis. And
Yeah,
yeah.
Yeah, I personally haven't had the privilege to work with them. I want to, but the work that I do is really just from the connections that I have with the families in that neighborhood, that they know that their kids want to be writers or want to give them a healthy outlet. And
Well,
then
that's
I've been
great.
doing
I'm going to connect you by email with my daughter
Absolutely.
because she runs 826 Minneapolis.
Oh, sweet,
So I'll connect you by email.
sweet.
And so
Thank you.
She would love to have you
Thank
working
you.
with the kids.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Now we're going to entertain. I had another question, but we're going to entertain questions from the chat. So if you have questions you want to ask any of these writers, please put it down in the chat. And I think Robin or Peter are going to read us the questions. And let's just say whoever wants to answer the question first, just begin to speak, and people will. Let's do more of a discussion type, a free flow. So
Yeah,
the first
thanks,
question.
David. Yeah, the first question was sent over, and it was from Nabila, who said, how do we address hypocrisy, lapsing kindness, and waning respect in the society we live in? Anyone want to answer that? And how have you addressed that in your writing, perhaps?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Sure, Caroline. The question was, how do we address hypocrisy, lapsing kindness, and waning respect in the society we live in?
Anyone want to address that?
Well, I'll start. I think hypocrisy, as writers, we're trying to write the truth. And obviously, sometimes it's a subjective truth that we're writing about, but it's the truth of our experience. It's the truth of how we view the world. And those truths run at odds many times with the way America has told the story of America. I have a book coming out next year, which is entitled The Stories Whiteness Tells Itself. And it's about racial narratives from the white perspective and the Black perspective, both in his history and fiction. And one of the things I start out with at the very beginning is America started with two goals. One goal was for freedom, equality, and democracy. The other goal was to maintain white supremacy in the form of slavery, in the form of colonialism, in the form of genocide. And those two goals have been at odds throughout America. And we're in a moment now where the telling of the whole history of America, which includes the pursuit of that second goal, which has been the institution and maintenance of white supremacy, has been deemed somehow like out of bounds. It's gonna, and the arguments are like, well, it's so long ago. Well, if it's so long ago and it doesn't matter, then why are you so upset that we're talking about these things, right? And so that's a huge form of hypocrisy. I think in terms of, I do a lot of speaking on issues of race, and I understand, many BIPOC people, activists, writers have reasons to be angry, to have feelings of antipathy towards others, which are very understandable. But when I'm trying to do the work of trying to help people understand the issues of race, I want to do it with love, with care, with humility. And by humility, I mean that none of us knows everything about race. None of us knows everything about all the different types of people that make up America. We all have things that we don't know. And we also all have what Donald Rumsfeld called unknown unknowns. And we're all going to make mistakes. And the important thing is for us to learn from mistakes. The important thing is for us to open our hearts to other ways of looking at the world. The important thing is to honor other people and their stories. And so I think that's one of the ways that, you know, and I feel like the writers in this book do that. Anybody else want to tackle this question?
Okay, thank you, David. That was wonderful. Thank you all for sharing. There was another question, and was lightly addressed a couple times. But if anybody wants to answer this one, how does spirituality affect your story? Is spirituality a unifying force among different peoples, or does it divide people based on their distinct belief systems?
I'm going to specifically ask Marcy to speak about this because, you know, her essay talks a lot about this, and also the horrifying effect of what the Indian boarding schools did in terms of trying to destroy Native American spirituality.
Can you just repeat the question again? Please.
Of course, Marcy. So it was, how did spirituality affect the story that you put in the book? And do you feel that spirituality is a unifying force among different people, or does it divide people based on their distinct belief systems?
So I think that organized religion, as it's practiced around most of the world, has been a dividing factor among all peoples. And that what Native American people practice is spirituality. That there isn't a separation between our value system, our political system, our spiritual system, our relationship with all living things, and recognizing that all things are living. And so if people have an authentic spiritual practice, it's a unifying thing. But when people get dogmatic around their religious beliefs and their religious preferences, then it becomes a highly destructive thing, like what happened to Native people in the boarding school systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcy. There was another question here. The focus is on the book was for more than one, the typical white voice. For the writers, has there ever been a time in your life when you've been able to write without the conscious or subconsciousness of being an other voice?
I will answer that, or I'll start to answer it. I mean, I think that the question is skewed. It assumes that whiteness is the something and that other is who we are. And I'm not another. I am an Anishinaabe woman. And yeah, that's my answer.
I would also kind of like to hear Suleiman, Kevin, and Carolyn also speak about spirituality, because I even though we had this other question, because I think it's important because each of you comes out of different spiritual traditions in your writing.
I would say that I would have to agree with much of what Marcy said. It is the dogma and the religious traditions that tend to divide people, not spirituality. When people who are, I would like to consider myself as a more spiritual person than a religious person. We're thinking about unifying and trying to bring people together with love and joy rather than, you know, my God is better than your God. And I think that, you know, I grew up in the African American, AME, African American Episcopal Church. I, to this day, don't know what that means because it just always, there was always that sense of, you know, division rather than trying to bring people together, in my opinion. My parents wouldn't agree with that, but that's how I feel.
Yeah, I think for me, I grew up in my family was, we believed in this a system of beliefs called animism, shamanism, belief in spirits, that's rooted in sort of our traditional culture. And then our family converted to Christianity when I was around 16 years old. And then as I grew older, like many of you describing, I detached myself from the idea of religion. But I think I appreciate hearing and learning from folks of different spiritualities and religions, and how that, like has been said, has affected our ability to understand each other and love each other when it does happen, and how overall how we see the world. It's not a super big way of how I see the world, but I know I do appreciate when I do have the chance to learn and see how others experience the world.
So I'm a teacher at a mosque, at a masjid, and I have been for years. Person who's memorized the Quran and do teach it, teach the Arabic language as well. I do see a lot of my faith and what I teach feeding into my work. On that point alone, faith, the spirituality part in Islam is called Iman, the faith that you have in God. Even when it comes to the pieces that I do write, a lot of it has to do with trust. One person may see it as individual accountability, like what can I do for myself, by myself, to achieve what I consider success. But as Muslims, as myself, it's you rely entirely on God. You do what you need to do to succeed, but also know that your reliance and your resilience should be with God and God alone. So when I do write about things that some may see as maybe sad, I do so with a caveat and the understanding that there is one, even if I have no one physically around me, that I do have something that I can still lean on. And that's how that spirituality feeds into my own writing.
Thank you. I want to address, from my own point of view, the issue of writing as another. There are certain points of what I'm dealing with as a writer where I'm dealing with the history and the effects of the history of Japanese America. But the other thing that I often do, is, especially in certain types of writing, is I'm writing to my own community. And Toni Morrison wrote to an African American community. I mean, she was aware that white people would judge her work, but she was writing to the African American community. And as she says in Playing in the Dark, you know, when I'm writing about Blackness, I can't write stereotypes because I know Black people, I know Black life, and you know, and so I'm addressing my Black readers without any sort of interlocutor, any sort of barrier. That's the one gift of writing. And I often tell my writing students that part of your work needs to make whiteness smaller, the voice of whiteness smaller and smaller inside yourself. I also tell them, don't give power to people who do not see you. You may have to contend with people who don't see you, but don't give them power. And that is one of the keys, I think, to being able to own your own voice. And at times, you know, because there are times when I'm writing and I'm trying to convince other people or to tell other people or to explain to other people, but you can also write to people in your own community. You can write to your own family. And one of the things I tell my students who are writing fiction, I said, you know, you can write your fiction, even if you're doing third person, you know, voice, the narrator can address the story to anybody. That, you know, as you can tell the tale in a way which you're writing to a general audience, but you can write the story and the narrator can tell the story to the community that you're part of. Junot Diaz does this in The Brief Wondrous History of Oscar Wilde. And you can even write a fictional story where the person is telling it to someone in their family. And obviously, if you're writing this, telling about a story to somebody in your family, you're not going to be conscious of whiteness. You're going to be conscious of the person in your family. And there is what I call an economy of explanation. Because if you're writing certain things to people in your family, you don't have to explain it. You don't have to do, if a Hmong narrator is writing to another Hmong about a Hmong story, they don't have to do that 50-word thing that Kevin talks about. All right, they can just assume you understand this, you understand Hmong words, and you may not, you know, and one of the things that people are dealing with is you don't even italicize the Hmong words maybe, because you know the person who you're telling the story to will understand it. But that's no different, you know, white writers are doing this all the time. They're writing to other white people, or in The Heart of Darkness, the guy speaking to a bunch of sailors on a boat, you know. But I tell my students, writers of color, you can do that too. We've come up on 8:30, which is the official end of this. I don't know, Robin, do you want to?
I just want to mention what Nahid Khan just posted. She just wanted people to be aware of MISNA, MISNA.org, Arab American Arts Organization, which is telling to visit their website, learn what we do, she said, with creatives with West Asia and North African connections, people of cultural heritages, influenced by Arab culture, history, and everyone interested in this overall cultural heritage and cultural community to the broadest way, in the broadest way. Writers, we do have a literary journal. MISNA does and is a literary journal. Please be aware of it. Thanks, Nahid, for pointing this out. Sorry, David.
No, that's fine. I think, Robin, you want to wrap this up?
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you for all your comments and questions in the chat. I want to thank our members who are here tonight. I want to thank the Eastside Freedom Library and the Roseville Library for being our partners in these stories. But most of all, I want to thank Carolyn Holbrook, David Mura, Suleiman Aden, Marcy Rendon, and Kevin Yang for a wonderful discussion. We so appreciate your sharing all your thoughts and stories with us tonight. It's been a wonderful discussion. And it will be up on our YouTube channels in a few days. What I'm going to do right now is, again, thank everyone for being here. I'm going to turn off the live stream. Again, thank you, everybody on